From claiming a healthy person doesn't need vaccines to having a completely AI-generated episode, Joe Rogan has had some pretty controversial episodes on his podcast. Let's dive into some of the most controversial ones yet. Let's begin with the one where he shared his take on vaccines. In episode 1639, Joe Rogan upset his fans with his controversial take on vaccines. This was back in April 2021, at the height of the pandemic, when people were already refusing to get vaxxed. So clearly, Joe's opinion didn't help the situation. In an interview with Dave Smith, the infamous radio personality Rogan shared his thoughts about the COVID-19 vaccine and explained how a person who's physically fit doesn't really need to get vaccinated to stay safe. This made the podcast go viral, and everyone was talking about it. Of course, this became the anti-vaxxers' new favorite episode, but just about everyone else was calling him out for what he said. In fact, the clip went so viral that even large news outlets like CNN were talking about it. In consequence, it didn't take long for the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease to comment on what Joe had said. If memory serves, he stated that Joe's statement about the vaccine was simply incorrect. And get this, things got so bad that even the White House released a statement calling the podcast host out. In another episode released shortly after this one, perhaps due to widespread backlash, Joe complained that people took what he said out of context and clarified that he was actually pro-vaccine. But it's not like he's the only one on the podcast to spark controversies and the one who needs to clarify his stances. Sometimes he gets tons of help from the guests he has on his show, some of which are just controversy in the flesh. Take his episode with Jack Dorsey as an example. Anyone who listens to Joe's podcast or has friends who listen to it would know that fans detest Jack Dorsey, the former CEO of Twitter. So he didn't even really need to say or do anything for fans to absolutely read him to filth for having the guy on the podcast. But then he provoked them even more when he didn't ask the questions fans wanted him to ask. They accused him of asking the ex-CEO softball questions, and that really rubbed his fans the wrong way. But you might be wondering, what exactly did the fans want to know from the guy? Well, they had asked Rogan to ask his host to explain how Twitter decides which accounts to ban. Not only that, they also wanted to bring up how Twitter was accused of having double standards when enforcing rules on their platform. And you might have guessed, Rogan asked nothing of the sort. So by the time the podcast was over, fans were fuming. It got so bad that Joe had to apologize to his fans, which we all know is a once-in-a-million-years kind of thing for the host. But a sorry wasn't going to make things right. So a few episodes later, he had Dorsey, along with the leader of Twitter policy, Vijay Gadde, on his podcast. And this time, he didn't shy away from asking everything his fans wanted to know. But this wasn't the only time a guest made fans mad with the podcast. It's time we talked about the episode with Alex Jones. Joe Rogan seems to never shy away from having controversial people on his podcast, but sometimes it's just a lot for everyone to digest. This was the case when he had the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones over. And yes, he's had him over a lot of times. But I'm talking about the time he had him on the podcast after Alex was banned from Apple, Facebook, and even YouTube in 2018. Now, having Alex on the episode after all that was obviously controversial, and the podcast host got a lot of backlash from not only his fans, but even the companies he was doing business with. He had signed a $100 million deal with Spotify just a few months before having the conspiracy theorist on his podcast. And after all the controversy, Spotify was reconsidering doing business with Joe. There were even rumors that Spotify was demanding Rogan to delete the episode. But ultimately, the episode stayed up, and Spotify decided to give Joe Rogan the freedom to have whoever he wants on his podcast. Well, little did they know, he was going to have no one on the podcast pretty soon. Well, no one but AI. Yep, the time has come to discuss the AI debacle. Now, don't get me wrong, the episode started out as normal, and if you watch it on mute, you wouldn't even know there's anything wrong with it. The different thing about the episode is that there are no real humans involved in the video or voiceover. It's all done by AI. The episode features Joe Rogan and OpenAI CEO Sam Altman as they talk about a lot of different things without once making it obvious that they're not even humans. The episode starts with Joe welcoming his listeners and viewers to the very first episode of the Joe Rogan AI Experience. Clever name. The AI-generated Joe Rogan introduces himself as the host before breaking the fourth wall and saying, or at at least that's what this AI model thinks I sound like. And that's the point where the podcast not only gets a lot more interesting, but it also gives its viewers chills. He then talks about how this technology is next level and explains that every word on the podcast has been AI generated through ChatGPT. And here we were, just writing our school essays with the program. Throughout the episode, the two AI-generated people discuss a lot of topics, and it feels like they're actual people recorded on camera. It's so flawless that if you never told someone that it was all AI-generated, they'd believe you.
Was it if Kanye West wrote a rap for ChatGPT? They put it on Instagram, but it's like it seems like a person saying it.
The episode was super controversial because it was just terrifying. The idea of AI just creating such a flawless episode. Goosebumps, honey! But AI is a horror of the future. Joe's been stuck in controversies because of horrors of the present, too. I'm talking about the time he misreported a wildfire story. Spreading misinformation is one thing that people can't stand, even if it's from their favorite star, and especially when it's about a serious issue. In episode number 1538, Rogan invited Douglas Murray, a British author, to talk about social issues and political issues. While talking about the issue of climate change and activism to save the planet, the podcast host started talking about how some activists take it too far. We all agree with that. Some people do tend to get extreme. But then he said something that really rubbed just about everyone the wrong way. He said that some activists in the United States go to great lengths to prove their point. And then he gave the example of how, according to him, some activists started wildfires in Portland, Oregon. This would have been a fine thing to discuss, but only if there was any truth to it. It didn't take long before the FBI, along with a bunch of major news outlets, called him out and debunked his claims of any such thing happening. The moment quickly went viral and had everyone talking about the issue. People were calling him out for spreading fake news. And when you're as influential and big as he is, that's a huge deal. So after facing a lot of backlash, he decided to address the issue himself. Here's what he said. After facing so much backlash and hate from not only his fans, but just about everyone else in the country, he knew he couldn't avoid the issue anymore. The podcast host took to Twitter to talk about the situation. Knowing he'd messed up, he knew he had to apologize to people for spreading misinformation. He explained that he should have confirmed the story before he talked about it on his podcast, which has thousands of listeners and is a great influence. He also said that he was sorry for doing that and explained that he had read one story about a man getting arrested for lighting trees on fire in Portland. Rogan admitted that he acted very irresponsibly on the podcast. And that's all about Joe Rogan's most controversial podcast episodes yet.